More on one of our top stories tonight, the alliance between Beijing and Moscow in the spotlight as Russian President Vladimir Putin wraps up his trip to China. For more analysis on this visit, we're joined by Steve Tsang. He's director at SOAS China Institute, live from London. Professor Tsang, if we look at this visit, if Russia wanted to if the purpose of this visit was to get public support from China, and if China's purpose was to give the support, but in a way that suggested it remained in control, did both sides get what they wanted?
Yes, I think you are completely right. Putin's goes to China clearly wanted to have the partnership with China reinforced, making it very clear that Russia is not on its own in the war in Ukraine and confronting the United States more generally. He's got that. Now, Xi Jinping wasn't really so much in there to show his support for Putin as to show that he is very much in charge and he is not simply singing to the American tune. Bearing in mind that only a few weeks ago, Antony Blinken was trying to gently warn the Chinese that secondary sanctions could be extended to China if China continue to give critical support to the Russian war efforts. And in that meeting, Xi Jinping made it very clear that China stands shoulder to shoulder with Russia.
So this gentle warning from Washington, not just from Mr. Blinken, we heard that from Ms. Yellen as well, Janet Yellen in China. And before that, late last year, that warning of secondary sanctions on Chinese banks and companies if they do anything to feed the Russian war machine. We did actually see China pull back on exports to Russia, or at least not openly, but the figures show March and April a drop of 13% from the Chinese side. So it does suggest China, maybe not openly, but privately, may be open to gentle pressure from Washington.
Well, China is very clear and consistent in its somewhat inconsistent approach to the war in Ukraine. Chinese policy since 2022, when the war started, was a policy of asserting neutrality, but supporting Putin and refusing to pay any price for it. The last component, the refusal to pay any price, means that China stopped short of providing items to Russia that they know will automatically trigger secondary sanctions. So far, China has not provided lethal weapons to Russia because they would automatically trigger secondary sanctions. Now then, the Americans have changed the formulation and becoming less clear about what would trigger secondary sanctions. The Chinese are finding it a lot more difficult to deal with.
Well,
and of course, Xi Jinping cannot openly say that.
Pardon me for cutting in. The very fact that
Yes.
China stops short, it realizes there are red lines, even if, as you suggest, they're not clear where those red lines are. This suggests that Washington, if it so choose, could put enough pressure, I suppose nuanced pressure on Beijing to drive a wedge between China and Russia. Is that even a possibility right now?
Well, I don't think it's a matter of the Americans being able to drive a wedge between China and Russia. I don't think that is going to happen because Xi Jinping is supporting Russia for his own reasons. And Putin is working closely with China because he needs to. And that will continue. But where it matters is that Xi Jinping is not willing to pay a price by China in order to sustain Putin. So there is a scope for the Americans to get China to stop supplying specific items or services to Russia if the Chinese know exactly what they are. But the Chinese are not going to ask the Americans, so what can I send and what can I not send? The Americans need to be clear, and the chances that the Chinese will act on that.
So clarity from Washington, and also the suggestion in the past that Russia may not be content to be, as is apparent, increasingly apparent, a junior partner in its relationship with China. Washington, is there any chance that the US could play on that to remind Russia that it might not want to be a junior partner in this marriage of convenience?
Well, the Russians clearly don't want to be a junior partner in the relationship. But the reality that Russia has to face is that Russia needs China more than China needs Russia at the moment. And therefore, Putin has to effectively accept that he is playing junior partners to China. But here, the Chinese have also very carefully made it appear that they are not treating Russia as a junior partner. They are giving all the courtesies due to Putin in a very spectacular way. So Putin can send a message back home and say that, no, not at all. We are good, equal partners with China.
All right, the final question here. Both sides last year, we hear talk of that no limits friendship, no limits partnership. But of course, there are always limits. And as you suggest, this partnership could become limited should some factors change that would change both their calculations of what is in their own self-interest. What could happen? I suppose I'm talking about Ukraine. Who could win or lose there to change China and Russia's calculation of their strategic partnership?
If the war continues to go difficult for the Russians, then the Russians will have to accept Chinese acceptance more or less on Chinese terms. But if Russia can get a spectacular and relatively quick success from today and get the war over with on Russian terms, then Putin will become less dependent on China, and the relationship can get a bit rather more tense because the Chinese will be getting rather less out of that partnership without limits than they thought they would. Bearing in mind that at the beginning of the war, the Russians benefited more from this partnership than China did. And China was hoping that it will get more in the longer term. That could change, of course, if Russia wins quickly.
All right, and of course, it would depend on who is in the White House when this victory happens. Thanks so much for joining us, Professor Steve Tsang, Director at SOAS China Institute.